My heart was broken for Charles Leclerc before the race even began today. I do not know how somebody can be so unlucky, but once again, Charles Leclerc does not get to start the race going out with a hydraulic issue on the car. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to break down the Brazilian Grand Prix and what happened throughout the race. If you do enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you're notified when the next episode does drop. And with that, let's get into it. As I previously mentioned, Charles Leclerc did not end up starting the race. Yes, he did unfortunately have an issue with his hydraulic system, which led to him spinning out and hitting the barriers on the reconnaissance formation lap before the race even began. Now, I can't even describe what he sounded like on that radio. He was heartbroken to not make it to the grid. He's had so many unfortunate events over the last couple years, and I don't blame him anymore. You can see that it's taking a toll on him because truly, it's incredible how this is happening. I do not know how somebody can be so unlucky, and I truly feel for him. With the red flag that came out right after the first turn, you could see that he was running back to the pits hoping that somehow they would be able to fix that car under the red flag conditions so that he would at least have a chance to race. But unfortunately that wasn't the case, and his afternoon ended before it even really started. Heartbreaking for Leclerc today, and hopefully this is the end of bad luck for Ferrari because truly as a fan, it's hard to take at this point, and I don't know how much more we can take. Aside from that, once the race actually did begin, we had an incident between Albon and Magnussen going into turn 1. This incident led to a lot of debris on the track and eventually brought out a red flag, which meant that the race start was essentially postponed. This did end up benefiting a couple drivers, sort of, such as Piastri and Ricciardo, who maybe wouldn't have been able to continue the race if there wouldn't have been a red flag, but since there was a red flag, they were able to work on their cars in the pits and go back out and race the actual race. Unfortunately, they started being down a lap because they weren't allowed to line up on the grid. They had to start from the pit itself and therefore weren't allowed to do the one formation lap essentially. So their race was basically ruined, but for data purposes, I guess it was still pretty okay. This was even more unfortunate because both cars, the AlphaTauri and the McLaren, had some serious pace and probably would have finished in the points if they were allowed to start on the grid alongside the other cars. Now, right off the bat, during the first start of the race, Lando Norris jumped up from P6 into P2. This meant that Norris was starting P2 on the restart. But what was even more interesting was that Alonso got a bit racy with Hamilton. Now, at the time, this seemed like it was a pretty good battle, but looking back on it, there wasn't really much of a debate about which car was faster today. Alonso was a king today in any aspect that you can think of, but we'll touch on that soon. Another interesting thing that came out of this incident right at turn 1 on the very first lap was some of the radio messages that came from Gasly regarding his teammate Ocon. He wasn't happy, and it seems that every time there's an issue, Ocon is always in heated debates with his teammates. No matter what teammate he has, he just can't seem to get along with them. And at some point you start to think, is it the teammates or is it an issue with Ocon himself? I don't know what's going to happen. As of now, Gasly is leading that team pairing in the standings, but that's something we'll have to keep an eye on and see how it does develop and if there is potential drama as well. What was also great to see during that first stint was Lando Norris tried to bring the fight to Max Verstappen. Everybody's made it clear and we all know that Max is having a phenomenal year and can't be touched. But that didn't stop Lando Norris from at least trying to make a move on Max towards the beginning of that first stint. Having jumped from P6 all the way to P2, he thought that now was his moment. With both of them being on soft tires, he deployed all the energy he had and went for the move. He came up right alongside Max Verstappen going into turn 4, but ultimately this didn't matter because Max quickly jumped out and got a gap of about 1.5 to 2 seconds, and essentially he had the lead comfortably all the way from there towards the end of the race. There was another interesting decision that McLaren took that I don't know if I would have taken exactly the same way they did, which was that they decided to pit Norris right on the same lap when Max Verstappen went into the pits as well to change his tires. Now essentially this didn't leave them the chance to maybe extend their first stint so they would have fresher tires on their second stint, and when you're in a car that isn't as pacey as the car ahead of you, this doesn't really give you any option towards strategy or any chance to overtake because you know that in simple race pace you just simply aren't quick enough. Towards the end of the race, on the second pit stop, they did go for a bolder, more risky move when they decided to keep Lando Norris out a couple more laps even though Max Verstappen had pit, because now he was in first position on track, and if there would have been a safety car or a virtual safety car, they could have entered Norris into the pits and changed his tires and hoped to be still leading the race in P1 after that incident. This didn't work out, but I do respect the decision made and the attempt at essentially overtaking Max, because on pure pace, he's untouchable at the moment. The Mercedes drivers were nowhere today in terms of pace. The main thing they ended up doing was battle with each other over the radios about swapping positions back and forth. Russell repeatedly was heard on the radio asking the team to tell Lewis to give him the position because he has more pace, he's quicker, and I don't know if they just didn't tell Lewis this or if Lewis decided not to listen to them, but it didn't happen at any point throughout the race, and we kept hearing the messages over and over. Russell was not happy, even passive aggressive at one point, but it didn't amount to anything because they had no pace in that car at all. They couldn't defend, they had no straight line speed, they were being overtaken by essentially everybody, and to make matters worse, they did end up having to retire George Russell's car towards the end of the race, so only Lewis Hamilton finished the race. This is a complete turn from last season when George Russell got his maiden and only win in Formula 1, and the Mercedes team finished 1-2 on the podium. I'm sure there's going to be some pretty tough moments in that garage today, and they're going to have a lot of things to discuss because clearly something isn't working, and I'm sure they were hoping for much more from the race today. Now, I do have to touch on the fact that after his performance at the Mexican Grand Prix, Perez came out swinging today. He seemed much more confident in the car, he knew what he wanted, and he was focused from the get-go. He was overtaking cars and charging through the field, hoping to get a podium position. The only problem was the GOAT himself, Fernando Alonso. Fernando Alonso put on a clinic today. He started P4 behind his teammate Lance Stroll, who he quickly overtook. But that's not what's important here. What's important is that he managed that race perfectly. He knew he wasn't really in a battle for the top two positions, so he just chilled, took it easy, and held P3 throughout the entire race. Now, towards the end of the race, Perez was quickly catching him, and we all know that that Red Bull car is much quicker than the Aston Martin car, especially the Aston Martin car as of now. So for the last 12, 13 to 15 laps, Alonso would have to put on a clinic of defensive driving, and he did just that. He held off Perez lap after lap after lap until the 70th lap, which is the second last lap, when Perez did end up overtaking him, but the composure that Alonso had to show to not be phased and just perfectly pick his lines to force Perez to drive defensively, which ended up leading to Perez being in a compromised line so that Alonso could overtake him in turn 4 on the final lap of the race. Now, you would think that P3 was then clinched for Alonso, but Perez had one more run up to the finishing line on the very last straight, and it was a photo finish at the end. Alonso ended up winning by 0.053 seconds. That's insane. That's a Lightning McQueen type performance. Fernando Alonso showed once again why he's a two-time world champion and one of the greatest of all time, no questions asked. That Aston Martin's been having a pretty rough go as of late, but today surely gave them the confidence to continue developing that car and come back even stronger next year. There's been many rumors of Alonso maybe going over to Red Bull or linked to other teams, and he said none of these rumors were true and there would be consequences. Well, these can be considered consequences. All in all, it was a pretty interesting race. I mean, Interlagos always gives us great racing. And it just extended its contract into 2030, so we have at least another 7 years of amazing racing at this track. Next up is the Las Vegas Grand Prix for the first time ever, and that's going to be an interesting race as well. That's in 2 weeks' time, and I'll make sure to break that one down as well right after the race. Until then, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications in case I do drop any other videos until then so that you can be notified. Also, if you want to stay up to date on other F1 related topics or just discuss F1, make sure to follow me on X where I'm much more active throughout the week. Thank you guys again and see you next time. Bye.